Welcome to the Williamsville Public Library and Museum. Today is September 8th, 2023. We're here talking to J.R. Fawns and his wife Sharon Fawns about his family's connections to service stations in Williamsville and specifically along Route 66. Could you tell us about the businesses that you had your involvement with, where they were located, what they were about?
My father worked for a farmer, and I was for 4 or 5 years old, and he decided that he wasn't going to be a farmer's helper anymore. And a job had opened in Williamsville for Charlie Sutton, who ran a garage, and he came in and talked to him and got hired, and that would have been probably in 1937 or 38, and that's when we moved to Williamsville. And this Charles Sutton, who owned the business, and his wife Ruby, Charlie was probably in the late 20s, early 30s. I'm not sure if it was his father, John Sutton, that ran the tavern next door.
Okay.
And my mom wasn't that happy about that part of it. But anyway, Charlie, that Dad worked for, was at the age when he and Ruby never had any children. They were drafting for World War II. And he was afraid that he might be at 30, 31 years old. Rather than be drafted, he chose to join so he could get into the service part that he wanted. And he did join and became an Air Force guy. And with that, the business was for sale. And my dad, who worked very hard, but back in those days, not much money was made. And when he had 3 children, that was a biggie for him. So he had to find some money. And he, at that time, knew a lot of people in the village. And one lady who lived across the alley from us, and I can't think of her name, but he borrowed enough money from her to buy Charles Sutton's garage. And so she loaned him the money, and that would have been in 1937 or 38. And that's when Dad started. But he had worked for Charlie for, I don't know, a couple of years, I guess.
Okay. Was that first station along Route 66?
The old Route 66.
Okay.
I like to use that word because
Okay.
it's still there and goes where the road goes by Brandt Fertilizer.
Okay.
It's blocked off now, but that was the old route that we were on right there.
Well, mention how you worked at that station when you were only 12 years old.
My dad, I don't know, my brother Bill, who was the oldest, had no interest in that at all. And my brother George was just a little young, so I became a part of Dad's garage down there. And once in a while, when he would have a repair on a vehicle, he had to go to Springfield to buy the parts. And he would leave me at the age of probably 12, 13 years old running that service station. And there was a family right across the street from us, Bozart, and Hattie Bozart was the lady in the house. And my dad would ask Hattie whenever something would happen that he had to go here or there and I wasn't around, Hattie would come over to that station and pump gas for customers going by. And I remember one time my father had left to get parts and I was left there and a customer came in, and I can, as I tell this, I can visualize it just like it happened yesterday. A customer came in and I remember he wanted to buy a package of cigarettes, and the showcase that was there had a broken glass in it. And when I reached in to get those cigarettes, I hit my hand on that open glass and really caused it. And the guy said, "Is there anything I can do to help?" And I said, "No, that's all right." So I got my handkerchief out and put on, and it got worse as he left. So I went outside and I yelled across the street for Hattie. And she came over and run the station while I went uptown to Dr. Cheryl. And I've been asked, when I tell that story, how many doctors did Williamsville have? And I said, well, we had 2. And I'm going to use the same phrase. Today, they'd probably be called quacks. But back then, they were called doctors. And Dr. Cheryl was our family doctor. And Dr. Cheryl was so close to my father that whenever we'd get sick, we'd go up and Dr. Cheryl would say, "Okay, go on." And they never paid. And when Dad did work for Dr. Cheryl, he never charged me.
Okay.
So that's how we got through all that.
Nice little barter system.
That's
then.
exactly it.
If you were working the gas station, were you just running the cash register when you were that young and somebody else was pumping the gas when you were young, when you first started? Is that what you were doing at the service station? Okay.
We were pumping the gas.
Yeah. Well,
So-
back then, the gas pump, you could see the gas in a bubble at the top of the pump, and it had marks across 1 gallon or a little mark for a half a gallon. And I think there was 5 gallon in that. Maybe it was 10, but then it was an opening. And you'd have to look at that as the gas came through. And if the guy wanted 3 gallon, you had to get to that spot and shut it off. But that's the way the gas pump was back then.
All right. What else did you end up doing at the service station as you were working for your dad?
Well, Natalie, he might mention here where during the war there was ration stamps, and so they had to deal with the ration.
And I can remember there was 3 different stamps. There was A stamp, B stamp, and C stamp. And the A stamp, you could get some fuel, but not that much. And B, you got a little bit more. And then C, you got the most you could get. And most farmers in the area got what they called that C stamp. Then they put it on the windshield of their vehicle, A, B, or C. And I mentioned this in another interview I've had about some farmers didn't use all the fuel that they were allowed to use. And they would come into my dad. He became very close friends to a lot of farmers in the area. And they would let my father have the extra amount of fuel that they could give to some person who had an A or B, but had a time when they really needed more.
Right.
And Dad was able to do that because
Right.
the farmers allowed them to have a little bit of their leftover.
Kind of the advantages of being in a small town.
Mm-hmm.
So as you grew up working in the service business, do you remember any specific customers or anything else about the people you worked with that really stand out in your mind?
I like the story about Cleo Patterson. Can I tell that?
Well, you do that.
Well, I don't know. A lot of people, she lived out here in the country and she had a son that was a Down syndrome. And she had this older car that was always breaking down. She would come in and he would work on the car. And so at one point, Gerard would sit out there. We had a dog and he would play with the dog. And one day he went back in the loop room where Wilbur was working and he asked him if he would marry his mother.
Oh.
And Cleo said, Gerard, he's already married to Poochie's mom, so you can't. But then she said to me, I wish I had some money, I could buy a better car. And I said, Cleo, I was out to her house a lot. And I said, have you got some antiques you would want to sell? And she said, sure. So we got Ronnie Sainer involved, and she sold all these antiques. And on a Monday morning, she came in the station and she had bought her she'd been to Grouse and bought her a brand new little Geo car. So that was one of my favorite customers, was Cleo and Gerard Patterson. He also, over the years, we tried to list all the people, all the men that had worked for him. And there was like over 80 kids and men. And they were most all really good workers. So we were blessed.
And I'll throw back into this. Several of those what were young people are now a little bit younger than me yet, but they're still getting older. And they've told me and thanked me, and I feel so good about that. They were taught the right thing, and I do feel awful good about that.
So they learned from the way you ran your business and the way you treated them as employees. What do you think? I mean, obviously you dealt with a lot of people over the years from the service perspective. What do you think made your service stations and the ones your dad ran, what do you think made those businesses special?
Well, let's go back to the standard station that we were in. A fellow was running a garage here in Williamsville, Dwayne Robinson, and Dwayne was getting older and he was about to retire. And he had been involved with Patterson Brothers Oil Company here in the village, and they are the ones that I was involved in for the years, many years after that. But anyway, Dwayne was about to retire, and Wyatt Patterson, the oldest Patterson of the Patterson brothers, came down to talk to Dad and me at the standard station and said, we are going to buy the ground right across from you, and we're going to build a shell station. And we hate to do that with the Patterson family and the Fawns family getting involved in competition that way. And what we're here for, to ask you, would you like to run it also? And it didn't take us long to figure that one out. And we said, well, yeah, let's go a little deeper into it. So they did. And before that could happen, we found out after we were in business a few years, I think it might have been Wyatt or his brother Paul that was with him and that Patterson brothers, told me that there's a part of that we haven't told you and your father. Before we could allow that to happen, Shell Oil Company and Standard Oil Company had to agree that the same family run a competitive business across from each other, and they allowed it, and that's how both stations got involved.
Okay, so your family ran both Standard and Shell gas stations, correct?
That's right.
Okay, so how many gas stations between your dad and you, how many different stations were you involved with over the years?
Well, just those, except
Okay.
finally when the interstate was built, Patterson Brothers built a new one closer to the exit off of the village, and so we moved there. And Standard at that time had built a small, what they called gas station only, right across the road from us on Old 66, and it didn't stay there long. For some reason, the Shell station was a bigger, because we had 3 bays to work cars, and they had only just selling gas, and they finally went down, and of course that helped us.
So really the difference between a gas station, what we think of today as a gas station, is just like you're saying, a gas station, but back in the day it truly was a service station because it served gas, but it also worked on the cars.
That's correct.
Obviously that's different than what we would have today. Is there anything else that you think makes it different in terms of the way you ran your businesses versus how gas stations or service stations are run today?
Well, I can kind of remember when I mentioned back in this interview about being 13, 14 years old. Back then, when we had the gas pumps with the liquid up there, gasoline at that time was 11, 12 cents a gallon. And when I look at the pumps today and see them at almost $4, it just seems unreal.
Right.
That's exactly the way it was.
It's kind of hard to imagine back then. If somebody had told you what gas would be today, you probably wouldn't have believed them. Eventually you did retire, and you've enjoyed your retirement here in Williamsville. What kind of things have you been doing in your retirement?
You know, I can't believe just last August, this year, 30 years of retirement. I can't believe it's been 30 years since I last run a service station. And Patterson Brothers had mentioned, when you leave, does your son want to run it? Brent had gotten in with me down there. And so I got him involved in it, and he didn't want any part of it. So 30 years ago. And
well, you might mention the reason you left. Patterson's was going to do away with the lube room and the 3 bays and put a convenience store in. He said, I don't want any part of that.
That was what most Shell and Standard and Sinclair, all of them decided to go a lot of places for just gasoline, and I didn't want to do that. So I was at the age where it was retirement anyway, ready.
But back to retirement, Natalie. After he retired, we did a lot of traveling. We've been to the Baseball Hall of Fame 3 different times because he's such a fan of baseball. And I don't know now, of course, we're not traveling very far, but we did enjoy a lot of trips. And we bought a motorhome, and we used that quite a bit.
I had a heart attack. That's been,
15 years ago.
Yeah, and I guess I was almost gone. I was in an ambulance taken to the hospital. But anyway, I look back on that and think how I got through that, and I started having doctor calls pretty often. And one of the doctors I still have became more than a doctor. He's a friend, a very close friend. And his son, and Carrie Vickers, who was a coach for Williamsville, and Carrie and his son were real good friends, so that helped a connection for me. But anyway, he told me one time, J.R. Wilbur, he calls me both, I'm going to tell you what to do, and you listen to me. He said, you get out of the chair and go, and go, and go. And we did, and that's when we bought the motorhome.
Well, he said, don't go home and sit in a chair, you'll be an old man. So we still try to go somewhere every day.
And you know, I got out of the chair, but I'm still an old man.
I don't know about that.
You might mention a close call you had with death after he got a wrecker, which was several years after he got the station there on the interstate. He was working on cars he had towed in, and it was a bad winter day, and snow was piled high, and he had the loop room doors open, but a gentleman that lived here in town, Ray Bensko, came in, and he said, this place is full of carbon monoxide. Start opening the doors. And they call, his brother was the cop here in town. They called him, and he took his brother to the hospital, and he was there for the whole day getting oxygen. And they said, don't go back in that building for 3 days because that
he said everything on the shelves or behind the shelves is loaded with that carbon monoxide, and kind of scared me.
Sure.
But that's been a bunch of years ago,
Sure.
and it still is.
Too tough to be taken out by something like that.
Now that we're talking about the station and different happenings, Sharon and I, when we moved out of the big house that we lived in for,
45
years or so, we moved down 2 doors into a smaller home. Everything was tougher for old people in the big house, upstairs, bathroom, bedrooms. So we got involved in moving, and with that happening, we had to move. Sharon is, I like to call him junker, but really it is not.
A collector?
Collector.
Thank you, Natalie.
And we had a lot of collections in the attic, and we were moving all them out, and I run across a television, an old television up there, and I said, honey, this thing still works. How come it's up here? And he said, well, you moved it up there when we decided to do some painting. And she said, let's take it out of that room so you'll have more room to paint. And the day that happened, I can remember this. These people that came in an old station wagon, and they had 3 or 4 little kids. And Sharon always said, probably you're doing that too much, but I did give a lot of free stuff away. And I feel good about that now, but some of the things that happened was, and this is what happened, when we got that television out of the attic, on the back of it, these people that had these children came in, and one of my employees come knock. I had a little office door, and I had a little window. I could see out, but they couldn't see in, and come knocked on my door, and they said, what are we going to do here, Fawns? And I said, what's that? And he said, these people, gas, they had to put their spare on, they had a blowout, and a couple other things, and he wants to see if I'd fill up a car full of gas, and they were going up to Navy.
Yeah, they had a son in the Navy, and they were going
going up to get him, and they said, on the way back, we'll stop and pay the bill. And after looking through the window and seeing those little children run around, we got that vehicle in, and we checked it out, and there was so many things that needed done. Put a new tire on, and change the oil, and filled it full of gas, and I don't know what the dollars were, but quite a bit back then. And they left. He shook my hand, and he came back in as they were ready to leave, and thanked me again, and said, I've got something in the back of that. He said, you have an awful nice rest area for customers. We had coffee in there and comfortable seating. And said, wouldn't it be nice to set a TV over there? And I said, yeah, we were thinking about that. And he said, well, just a minute. So they brought that TV in. And it was a nice TV. We plugged it in and had the antenna on top of it. And it did come in real good. And I said, well, we'll take that off your bill then. What do you want for it? I don't want anything. You did good for me, and I'm going to do it. I said, okay. So that day we were ready to move stuff from the attic. The TV was involved. And as I picked it up to carry it into a different room, Sharon said, what's that on the back? And I said, what do you mean? He said, there's something written on the back of it. And when I turned around and looked, it said, property of Dreamland Motel.
Oh dear.
So we weren't told that's what happened, but it sounds like
Right.
they probably took it out of the motel.
Right. We had some fun stories over the years
We've
at the
had a
service
lot
stations.
of them.
And one time, Natalie, I want to throw this in. There were so many stories, so many things happened. But one day I spent a lot of time down there because I like people and I like to hear where they're going and when they're coming home. One time a van pulled in with all these kids and they were running everywhere and going to the bathroom, and the van left, and here's 2 or 3 kids left.
No.
So anyhow, we called the state police. They stopped the van. They came back and got their kids. So there was a lot of crazy things.
Well, we were told, though, they had like 2 or 3 families involved with the kids.
Sure.
So evidently he forgot his count.
Right.
But we didn't.
Well, thank you for sharing your fun stories. We really appreciate it. Thanks for taking your time today and joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.